I need access to our savings account, my husband Lawrence said, his voice steady, as he stood in our kitchen doorway. For the marketing campaign at work. It's urgent. 3 days later, I discovered he'd transferred $127,000 to his girlfriend Camille. What he didn't know was that I wasn't just his wife. I was the silent owner of Mills and Associates, the consulting firm where he worked as senior partner. His smug confidence was about to become his biggest mistake. The morning I discovered the transfer, I was sitting in our home office in Westfield. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sipping coffee while reviewing what I thought were routine bank statements, Lawrence had already left for work, kissing my cheek with the same casual affection he'd shown for 8 years of marriage. The house felt peaceful in that quiet way I'd grown to treasure, until I saw the withdrawal. $127,000, transferred to an account I didn't recognize. My hands went cold as I stared at the screen. This wasn't a business expense or investment. This was our entire emergency fund, the money we'd saved for years, gone in a single transaction authorized by Lawrence 3 days ago, the same day he'd asked me about accessing our savings for his urgent marketing campaign. I called the bank immediately, my voice surprisingly steady as I spoke to our representative, Mrs. Bosch. The transfer on Tuesday, I said. I need details about the receiving account. There was a pause, then typing. The funds went to a personal account registered to Camille Crawley. Would you like me to? I hung up before she could finish. Camille Crawley, Lawrence's new marketing coordinator at Mills and Associates, the young woman he'd hired 6 months ago, praising her fresh perspective and innovative ideas at every dinner conversation. The same woman whose name had started appearing in his phone notifications with increasing frequency. My first instinct was to call him, to demand an explanation. Instead, I sat back in my chair and did something that surprised even me. I smiled. Because Lawrence had just made a critical error in judgment. He'd stolen from someone he thought was powerless, someone he'd systematically undermined and dismissed for months. What Lawrence didn't know, what I'd kept carefully hidden for nearly a decade, was that I wasn't just Sienna Mills, the supportive wife who managed our household finances and occasionally helped with his presentation slides. I was the true owner of Mills and Associates, the consulting firm where he strutted around as senior partner, commanding respect and a 6-figure salary. The irony was delicious. He'd stolen our money to impress a woman who worked for me. I opened my laptop and accessed a secure folder I hadn't touched in months, the real financial records of Mills and Associates, the ones that showed my 75% ownership stake, acquired 8 years ago, when Edgar Mills, the founder, needed an emergency investor to save his failing business. Lawrence had introduced me to Edgar as his brilliant wife with some family money to invest. What started as a $300,000 investment to help a struggling friend had evolved into majority ownership of a company now worth $4.2 million. Edgar and I had agreed from the beginning to keep my ownership quiet. Lawrence was already working there as a junior consultant, and we didn't want to complicate his career prospects with nepotism accusations. The arrangement worked perfectly. I remained the silent partner while Lawrence climbed the ranks, believing his success was purely merit-based. For 8 years I'd watched him take credit for strategies I'd helped develop, seen him present my ideas as his own innovations, and listened to him dismiss my business insights at home while implementing them at work the next day. I'd told myself it was temporary, that eventually we'd reveal the truth and share the success properly. Now, staring at the evidence of his betrayal, I realized how naive I'd been. My phone buzzed with a text from Lawrence, "Working late tonight, don't wait up, big presentation tomorrow." I knew that was a lie, because as the actual owner of Mills and Associates, I had access to everything: schedules, email systems, financial records, security footage. There was no big presentation tomorrow, but there was something else, something I'd been trying to ignore for weeks. I opened the company's security portal and scrolled to yesterday's footage from the executive floor. There was Lawrence's office, and there was Camille entering at 7:23 p.m., long after the official workday ended. The cameras showed her leaving at 10:47 p.m., her hair disheveled, her professional blazer wrinkled. The pattern had been building for months. Late meetings that weren't on any calendar, business dinners at expensive restaurants charged to the company, weekend strategy sessions that produced no documented results. I'd watched it all unfold through security feeds and expense reports, each piece of evidence carefully filed away in my mind. But transferring our savings, our future to her personal account, crossed a line that changed everything. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing 8 years of financial records, employment documents and security footage. What I found was worse than simple adultery. Lawrence had been systematically abusing his position, funneling company resources to Camille's pet projects, approving raises and bonuses for her that far exceeded industry standards. He'd created a consulting position specifically for her that duplicated work already handled by other departments. Most damaging of all, he'd been sharing confidential client information with her, information she had no clearance to access, information that if disclosed to competitors, could destroy the company's reputation and trigger massive lawsuits. By noon I had compiled a comprehensive file of Lawrence's misconduct. By 2 p.m., I had scheduled a meeting with Edgar Mills for the following morning. By 5 p.m., I had transferred the evidence to a secure drive and hidden it in our home safe, the same safe where Lawrence kept what he thought were his most important documents. When Lawrence came home that evening at 11:30 p.m., reeking of Camille's perfume and carrying takeout from an expensive restaurant, I was waiting in the living room with a glass of wine and a calm smile. "How was the presentation prep?" I asked innocently. He paused, clearly having forgotten his earlier lie. "Stressful," he said finally, "but I think we're in good shape for tomorrow." "I'm sure you are," I replied, taking another sip of wine. "Lawrence, we need to talk about something." I noticed an unusual transaction in our savings account. The color drained from his face, but he recovered quickly. "Oh, that. Yes, I meant to mention it. Emergency expense for the marketing campaign. I'll have it reimbursed by the company within a week." "A week," I repeated calmly. "That's quite fast for corporate reimbursements." "Edgar's being flexible given the urgency," Lawrence said, already heading toward the stairs. "I'm exhausted. Can we discuss this tomorrow?" "Of course," I said. "Sleep well. You'll need your energy for what's coming." He paused at the bottom of the stairs, something in my tone making him turn back, but I was already returning to my wine, my expression serene. After a moment, he continued upstairs, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my plans. Tomorrow would be a very interesting day at Mills and Associates. What Lawrence didn't know was that I'd been suspicious for 3 months, ever since I'd accidentally discovered their secret relationship in the most mundane way possible. It was a Tuesday evening in September when I'd stopped by Mills and Associates to drop off Lawrence's forgotten reading glasses. He'd called me that afternoon, complaining about an important contract review he couldn't complete without them. The building was mostly empty at 7 p.m., just a few lights scattered across the floors visible from the parking garage. I used my key card. Edgar had given me access years ago as a family courtesy, and took the elevator to the executive floor where Lawrence's corner office was located. The hallway was dimly lit, but I could see light spilling from under his office door. I approached quietly, not wanting to interrupt if he was on a client call. That's when I heard Camille's voice, low and intimate in a way that made my stomach clench. "The Baxter account files you wanted," she was saying. "I've highlighted the sections where we can increase billable hours without them noticing." "Perfect," Lawrence replied, his voice carrying a warmth I hadn't heard directed at me in months. "You understand the business better than half the partners here." I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering as I listened to them discuss client manipulation strategies that would be considered fraud if implemented. But it wasn't the unethical billing practices that froze me in place, it was what came next. "When are you going to tell Sienna about us?" Camille asked, her voice soft and vulnerable. There was a long pause before Lawrence answered. "After the Henderson merger goes through, I need to secure my position first, make sure Edgar sees me as indispensable. Once that's locked in, I can handle the divorce proceedings." "You promised it would be soon," Camille said, and I could hear the hurt in her voice. "I'm tired of sneaking around, tired of pretending to be just your employee." "I know, baby. I know." The endearment hit me like a physical blow. "But Sienna's not as helpless as she seems. She's got some kind of leverage with Edgar. I've never figured out what. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I need to be careful about how I handle this. My breath caught. He suspected something about my relationship with Edgar, but clearly had no idea of the true extent of it. What kind of leverage could she possibly have? Camille scoffed. She's just a housewife who plays around with spreadsheets. Edgar probably feels sorry for her. Lawrence's laugh was cold and calculating. That's what I thought too, but Edgar listens to her opinions about company strategy more than he should. And she always seems to know things about the business that I haven't told her. Last month she asked me about the Morrison account, before I'd even mentioned we were pursuing it. I remembered that conversation. I'd learned about Morrison Industries through the weekly reports Edgar sent me as the primary investor, but I'd had to pretend I'd overheard Lawrence talking to a colleague. Maybe she's going through your emails, Camille suggested. Maybe. Either way, I need to neutralize whatever influence she has before I make any major moves. The last thing I need is her poisoning Edgar against me during divorce proceedings. Camille's voice turned calculating. What if we could access their joint accounts? Transfer the money to somewhere safe before she can touch it. If she's left financially dependent on you, she'll be more cooperative about the divorce terms. My blood turned to ice. They weren't just planning to end my marriage. They were planning to steal everything I'd worked for, and leave me with nothing. That's brilliant, Lawrence said, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. She handles all our personal finances, so she has access to everything. If I tell her it's for a company emergency, she'll give me the account information without question. She trusts me completely. How much are we talking about? Camille asked. About $130,000 in savings. Plus she has some kind of investment portfolio from her grandparents. I've never gotten exact figures, but it's substantial. If we can get control of that money before the divorce, I can offer her a settlement that seems generous, but is actually a fraction of what she's worth. They spent the next 20 minutes planning my financial destruction with the casual efficiency of a business meeting. Camille would open a new account under her name. Lawrence would convince me to give him access to our savings for a fake company emergency. Once the money was transferred, they'd wait a few months before initiating divorce proceedings, giving them time to hide the assets properly. What about the company? Camille asked. Will you still be able to work here after the divorce? That's the beauty of it, Lawrence said smugly. Edgar likes Sienna, but I'm the one with the client relationships, the revenue streams. The company needs me more than it needs his sympathy for my soon-to-be ex-wife. Besides, by then you'll be promoted to senior associate, and we can present ourselves as the new power couple of Mills and Associates. I listened to them destroy my life with the methodical precision of consultants solving a client problem. Every concern Camille raised, Lawrence had an answer for. Every potential obstacle, they found a way around. They'd thought of everything, except the one thing that would make their entire plan impossible. Finally their voices grew softer, more intimate. I heard the unmistakable sounds of them physically embracing. Lawrence murmuring endearments that he hadn't spoken to me in over a year. The contrast between his tender voice with her and his dismissive tone when discussing me was devastating. I slipped away from the door and made it to the elevator before my composure cracked. In the parking garage, sitting in my car with Lawrence's forgotten reading glasses still clutched in my hand, I finally allowed myself to cry. Not just for the marriage I was losing, but for the naive trust I'd placed in someone who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to overcome. But my tears dried quickly, replaced by something harder and more determined. They wanted to play games with my finances. They had no idea what they were up against. I drove home and spent the night researching divorce attorneys, forensic accountants, and private investigators. By morning, I had a plan of my own. 3 days later, when Lawrence asked me for access to our savings account for his urgent marketing campaign, I knew exactly what he was really planning. And I was ready. To understand how devastating Lawrence's betrayal truly was, you need to know how we began. 8 years ago, I was Sienna Rudd, a 28-year-old financial analyst who just inherited $400,000 from my grandmother's estate. Lawrence Mills was the ambitious junior consultant who swept me off my feet at a charity fundraiser in downtown Hartford. I'd attended the event reluctantly, dragged there by my college roommate Joy, who insisted I needed to get out and meet people after my grandmother's funeral. I was still processing the grief, still figuring out what to do with the unexpected inheritance that came with strings attached. My grandmother's letter specifically requesting that I use the money to build something meaningful, not just safe. Lawrence approached me during the silent auction, confident and charming in his perfectly tailored suit. While other men had tried clumsy pickup lines, he engaged me in genuine conversation about the nonprofit's mission, demonstrating knowledge about microfinance that impressed me. When he mentioned working for a small consulting firm specializing in sustainable business practices, I was immediately interested. Mills and Associates, he said, when I asked about his company. We're small but growing fast. My boss Edgar Mills is brilliant. He's built something really special, helping mid-size companies implement environmental initiatives that actually improve their bottom line. The passion in his voice reminded me of my grandmother, who'd always believed business could be a force for good. When Lawrence offered to introduce me to Edgar the following week, I agreed immediately. That introduction changed everything. Edgar Mills was nothing like the slick consultants I'd encountered in my corporate job. He was soft-spoken but incredibly knowledgeable, with weathered hands that spoke of his engineering background and eyes that lit up when discussing renewable energy solutions. His small office was cluttered with prototypes and sustainability reports, the workspace of someone who genuinely cared about his work rather than just profit margins. The problem, Edgar explained during our coffee meeting, is that good intentions don't pay the bills. We've got contracts with 3 major manufacturers who want to reduce their carbon footprint, but I need capital to hire the right specialists and upgrade our research capabilities. Lawrence sat beside me, occasionally adding insights that showed his deep understanding of the business. The dynamic between them was clearly father and son, though they shared no blood relation. Edgar had hired Lawrence straight out of business school and mentored him through every aspect of the consulting industry. How much capital are we talking about? I asked, my grandmother's letter fresh in my mind. Edgar glanced at Lawrence uncertainly. Well, ideally $300,000 would let us expand properly, but that's probably unrealistic for a small firm like ours. Most investors want to see bigger returns than we can promise in the short term. I surprised them both by saying, what if I could provide that? The due diligence process took 6 weeks. I reviewed their client contracts, financial statements, and business projections with the thoroughness my corporate background had taught me. Edgar's vision was sound, his client relationships strong, and his expertise genuine. The company was profitable but cash poor, exactly the kind of situation my grandmother's inheritance could transform. But it was Lawrence who convinced me to take the leap. During those 6 weeks we began dating seriously. He would pick me up after my analyst job, take me to dinner at small restaurants where he'd share his dreams for the company's future. He spoke about environmental consulting with genuine passion, about making a difference while building financial security. Edgar's getting older, Lawrence confided one evening over wine. He needs someone to help carry the vision forward, someone who understands both the mission and the business side. I think we could build something amazing together, you, me, and Edgar. The we in that sentence sealed my decision. I wasn't just investing in a company, I was investing in a shared future with the man I was falling in love with. The legal structure we created was complex but carefully designed. I would own 75% of the company as the primary investor, Edgar would retain 20% as founder and CEO, and Lawrence would receive 5% as senior partner with the potential to earn more through performance bonuses. My ownership would remain confidential, listed in the corporate documents but not disclosed to employees or clients. It protects everyone, Edgar explained as we signed the papers. Lawrence can build his reputation without nepotism questions, you can learn the business without pressure, and I get the capital I need to grow. Lawrence proposed 3 months later, on the same rooftop restaurant where we'd had our first official date. The ring was modest but thoughtful, he'd noticed I preferred classic styles over flashy stones. When he slipped it on my finger, he whispered, I want to build everything with you. The company, our marriage, our future. Our wedding was small but perfect, held in the garden behind Edgar's house with Mills and Associates employees serving as both colleagues and family. Edgar walked me down the aisle since my parents lived across the country, tears in his eyes as he whispered, "You're getting a good man, and he's getting the partner he needs." For the first few years, Lawrence's prediction seemed accurate. I started working at Mills and Associates part-time, officially as a financial consultant, but really learning every aspect of the business from Edgar. Lawrence thrived in his expanded role, bringing in new clients and developing innovative service packages. We moved into a beautiful colonial house in Westfield, adopted a golden retriever named Jasper, and talked about children we'd have once the company was more established. I loved those early years. Lawrence would come home excited about client breakthroughs, and I'd share insights from my work with Edgar on strategic planning. We'd spend evenings reviewing proposals together, Lawrence respecting my business instincts and often implementing my suggestions. I felt like a true partner in every sense. The changes started subtly about 3 years ago. Lawrence began staying later at the office, claiming increased client demands. He started dismissing my business opinions at home, while mysteriously implementing similar ideas at work the following week. When I'd mentioned strategic concerns I'd discussed with Edgar, Lawrence would brush them off as overthinking, even as he addressed those exact issues in staff meetings. Most telling was how he began introducing me at company events. Instead of my wife Sienna, who's been instrumental in our growth, I became my wife Sienna, who helps with the books sometimes. Instead of acknowledging my insights during strategic discussions, he'd nod politely and change the subject. I told myself it was natural growing pains, that Lawrence was establishing his authority as he took on more responsibility. Edgar assured me this was normal behavior for ambitious young executives, learning to balance personal and professional relationships. What I didn't realize was that Lawrence had started seeing me not as his partner, but as his secret advantage, someone with insider access he could exploit without credit or consequence. Now sitting in our living room as he lied about company reimbursements for money he'd stolen to impress another woman, I finally understood the truth. To Lawrence, I'd never been his equal. I'd been his unknowing source of capital, connections, and intelligence. But tomorrow he was going to learn exactly who he'd been underestimating all these years. What Lawrence never discovered, despite 8 years of marriage and daily proximity to the business, was the true extent of my involvement in Mills and Associates. He thought my 75% ownership was simply a paper arrangement, a wealthy wife providing capital, while the real business decisions were made by Edgar and himself. He had no idea that Edgar and I spoke almost daily, that every major strategic decision passed through me for approval, or that I had been the driving force behind the company's most profitable innovations. The morning after Lawrence's lie about the marketing campaign, I sat in my home office reviewing the real structure of our business relationship. On my computer screen were 8 years of confidential communications between Edgar and myself, emails marked confidential owner only, that revealed the true power dynamics at Mills and Associates. The investment agreement Melissa Parker had drafted for me wasn't just about protecting my money, it was about protecting my vision. Hidden within the legal language were clauses that gave me unprecedented control over the company's direction, hiring decisions, and financial operations. Lawrence had never read the full document. He'd focused only on the percentage splits and his own compensation package. Clause 12.3 stated that any expenditure over $50,000 required written approval from the majority shareholder. Lawrence's recent spending sprees with Camille had violated this repeatedly. Clause 15.7 specified that romantic relationships between employees required disclosure to prevent conflicts of interest. Clause 18.2 was the nuclear option. Any breach of fiduciary duty by senior management resulted in immediate termination and forfeiture of equity stakes. But my real protection went deeper than legal documents. It was built into the daily operations of the company, in ways Lawrence never noticed. Edgar forwarded me copies of every significant email, every client proposal, every financial report. What Lawrence thought were casual conversations between Edgar and myself were actually detailed strategy sessions. When Lawrence presented ideas at staff meetings, he was often unknowingly pitching concepts that Edgar and I had developed in our private discussions. The Morrison Industries account that had made Lawrence suspicious. I had initiated that relationship through my college roommate Joy, who worked in their sustainability department. The Baxter account that generated $300,000 in annual revenue. I had designed the service package they purchased. The Henderson merger that Lawrence saw as his ticket to security. I had been negotiating the terms directly with their CEO for 6 months. Lawrence took credit for my innovations because Edgar and I had deliberately allowed it. We needed him to be successful for the company to grow, but we also needed to maintain the fiction that he was earning his achievements through merit alone. It was a delicate balance that had worked perfectly, until his ego convinced him he could betray the very person who made his success possible. My computer chimed with an encrypted message from Edgar. Emergency meeting this morning. Your husband's activities are creating serious liability issues. I typed back, absolutely. My house, 8 a.m. Coffee's ready. Edgar Mills arrived precisely on time. As always. At 67, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for what mattered most. His gray hair was neatly combed, his casual Friday attire impeccable, but I could see the stress in the lines around his eyes. This is worse than we thought, he said, accepting the coffee mug I offered. I've been monitoring Lawrence's activities since you called yesterday. The financial irregularities go back 18 months. He opened his tablet and showed me a spreadsheet that made my stomach sink. He's been manipulating client billing codes to fund what he calls business development activities. Expensive dinners that produce no new business, hotel rooms charged to accounts that have no travel components, consulting fees paid to Camille's shell company for work that was never delivered. How much? I asked quietly. $73,000 in company funds diverted over the past year and a half. Combined with the $127,000 he stole from your personal accounts, we're looking at $200,000 in theft. Edgar scrolled through transaction records, each entry representing another betrayal. But the money isn't even the worst part. He's been sharing confidential client information with Camille, allowing her to use our proprietary methodologies for freelance projects. If our clients discover this, the lawsuits alone could destroy us. I reviewed the evidence Edgar had compiled, each document more damaging than the last. Lawrence hadn't just stolen money, he'd jeopardized every relationship, every contract, every innovation that had built Mills and Associates into a $4.2 million company. There's something else, Edgar said quietly. I think he's planning to take Camille and start a competing firm. I found this in his office computer yesterday. He showed me a business plan titled Crawley Consulting Solutions. Camille's last name prominently featured as the company founder. The client list included every major account from Mills and Associates, complete with inside information about contract renewal dates and billing rates. The financial projections assumed they could steal 60% of our business within the first year. He's using our client relationships, our methodologies, and apparently your stolen money to fund a direct competitor, Edgar said. Classic corporate theft, but unusually brazen. I studied the business plan, noting Lawrence's careful fingerprints throughout the strategy. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision driven by infatuation. This was a calculated plan to destroy the company that had made him successful, using the trust and access we'd freely given him. Edgar, I said slowly, I need you to understand something. What we're dealing with isn't just theft or even corporate espionage. Lawrence has systematically betrayed every person who believed in him, every principle we built this company on. He's stolen from me personally, from the business we've built together, and from the employees who depend on us for their livelihoods. Edgar nodded grimly. What do you want to do? I walked to my safe and retrieved the folder I'd prepared the night before. I want to use every protection clause in our original agreement. I want to activate the security protocols we hoped we'd never need, and I want to do it in a way that ensures he can never harm another business or another partner ever again. The board will need to be involved, Edgar warned. This isn't something we can handle quietly. Good, I replied. I want this to be public. I want every client, every employee, every potential future partner to understand exactly what kind of person Lawrence Mills really is. Edgar was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. When do we start? We already have. I've scheduled a meeting with our attorney this afternoon to review the termination procedures. Tomorrow morning, I want you to call an emergency board meeting. By Monday, Lawrence Mills will no longer be associated with Mills and Associates in any capacity. And Camille, I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Camille Crawley is about to learn that corporate theft has consequences. Real ones. As Edgar gathered his documents to leave, he paused at the door. Sienna, I need you to know, I never suspected Lawrence was capable of this level of betrayal. If I had seen the signs earlier, you couldn't have known, I interrupted. He fooled me too, and I was married to him. But Edgar, we're not victims here. We're business owners who built something valuable, and we're going to protect it. After he left, I sat alone in my office, staring at the evidence of Lawrence's systematic betrayal. In a few hours I would begin the process of dismantling everything he thought he'd achieved. But first I had one more call to make. I dialed the number for Melissa Parker, the attorney who'd protected me 8 years ago with her ironclad contracts. Melissa, I said when she answered, remember those termination clauses you insisted on? It's time to use them. Looking back, the warning signs had been building for over a year, but I'd been too trusting to recognize them as the systematic preparation for betrayal they actually were. The changes in Lawrence started small, so subtle that I convinced myself they were just natural evolution in our marriage and his career growth. It began with the phone calls. Lawrence had always been accessible during work hours, often texting me updates about his day, or calling to ask my opinion on client situations. But around 15 months ago, those communications became guarded. When I'd call his office, his new assistant, Camille, would answer with increasing frequency, explaining that Lawrence was in meetings or with clients even during times when I knew his calendar was clear. He's really focused on the Henderson project, Camille would say, her voice professionally sweet. I'll make sure he gets your message as soon as he's free. But when Lawrence came home, he'd seem surprised that I'd called at all. Oh, Camille mentioned you phoned, but it seemed routine, so I didn't want to interrupt my workflow, he'd explain. You know how important this project is. The Henderson merger had become his obsession, or so I thought. He'd work late 3 nights a week, come home energized but evasive about details. When I'd ask specific questions about the merger terms, questions that came naturally given my actual role in the negotiations, he'd dismiss my curiosity as not really your area, sweetheart. That phrase became his standard deflection. When I'd mention concerns about client retention rates, it was not really your area. When I'd suggest new service offerings based on market research I'd done with Edgar, it was something we'll consider, but you don't see the full picture. When I'd point out discrepancies in the company's financial reports that Edgar shared with me, Lawrence would pat my hand condescendingly and say, "The books are more complicated than they look, Sienna. Trust me to handle the business side." The irony was devastating. He was dismissing insights from the company's actual owner, while positioning himself as the authority on business I'd helped build. His treatment of me at company events became particularly telling. At the annual Client Appreciation Dinner last spring, I'd been chatting with Marcus Bosch from Henderson Industries about their sustainability goals. I was carefully gathering intelligence for the merger negotiations when Lawrence appeared at my elbow. "Honey, Marcus doesn't need to hear about your gardening projects," he said, with a laugh that felt like a slap. "Let's let him enjoy his dinner." Marcus looked confused. We'd been discussing large-scale renewable energy initiatives, not gardening, but Lawrence smoothly steered the conversation toward sports, while guiding me away from what he clearly saw as important business discussions. Later that evening, I overheard him apologizing to Marcus. "Sienna means well, but she doesn't really understand the technical aspects of what we do. She's more of a numbers person, helps me keep track of household finances, that sort of thing." Household finances. As if the strategic financial analysis I provided Edgar was equivalent to balancing a checkbook. The exclusion became more systematic after Camille's promotion to executive coordinator 6 months ago. Suddenly, there were client dinners I wasn't invited to, weekend strategy retreats that were supposedly too technical for me to attend, and evening meetings at the office that Lawrence claimed were just boring operational stuff. "You wouldn't enjoy it anyway," he'd say when I'd ask about these events. "It's all spreadsheets and regulatory compliance. Why don't you use the time to catch up with Joy, or work on your book club?" My book club. As if intellectual engagement outside of his narrow definition was some quaint hobby, rather than the analytical thinking that had built his career. The financial red flags started appearing around the same time. Our joint credit card statements showed charges at expensive restaurants on nights when Lawrence claimed to be working late on documents, hotel rooms in nearby cities when no business travel was scheduled, charges at jewelry stores that never resulted in gifts for me. When I'd ask about these expenses, Lawrence had explanations ready. The restaurants were client entertainment that would be reimbursed. The hotel rooms were for out-of-town clients he was hosting. The jewelry store charges were surprise gifts he was still planning. "You're becoming awfully suspicious lately," he said, when I pressed for more details about a $2,400 dinner at the most expensive restaurant in Hartford. "Don't you trust me to manage business expenses appropriately?" The manipulation was subtle but effective. By questioning his expenses, I was being paranoid and controlling. By asking about his work, I was overstepping boundaries. By offering business insights, I was interfering in areas beyond my expertise. But the most devastating warning sign was how he'd started talking about our future. The conversations about children we'd planned to have disappeared entirely. The discussions about renovating our house were postponed indefinitely. The retirement planning we'd always done together became too complicated for joint decisions. "I need to focus on securing my partnership position before we make any major life changes," he'd say, when I'd bring up the family planning discussions we'd been having for years. "Once Edgar officially names me as his successor, then we can think about expanding our family." Edgar's successor. The delusion was breathtaking. Lawrence genuinely believed that Edgar was planning to hand over control of the company to him, despite Edgar's regular conversations with me about long-term leadership transitions that involved very different plans. 3 months ago, the deception became personal in a way that should have ended my denial immediately. Lawrence began working out regularly, buying new clothes and paying attention to his appearance with an intensity he hadn't shown since our early dating days. When I complimented his new fitness routine, he shrugged it off. "Just trying to project more authority at work," he said. "Image matters in client relations." But the client relations apparently required expensive cologne that he'd never worn around me, dental whitening treatments that he scheduled during work hours, and a wardrobe upgrade that focused heavily on evening wear rather than business attire. I found myself checking his gym bag one evening, and discovering it contained clothes he'd never worked out in, designer shirts still with tags, dress pants that would be completely inappropriate for exercise, cologne and grooming products that suggested his fitness routine involved more socializing than actual fitness. When I confronted him about this, Lawrence's response was pure gaslighting. "I can't believe you're going through my personal belongings," he said, turning my discovery into evidence of my own character flaws. "This kind of paranoid behavior isn't healthy, Sienna. Maybe you should consider talking to someone." Talking to someone, as if my rational concerns about obvious deception were signs of mental instability rather than normal responses to his increasingly obvious lies. The final warning sign came just 2 weeks before he transferred our savings. I'd been reviewing our investment portfolio when I noticed he'd been asking detailed questions about our account access procedures, about whether withdrawals required both signatures, about how quickly large transfers could be processed. "Just trying to understand our financial position better," he explained. When I asked about his sudden interest, "If something happened to you, I'd need to know how to handle everything." The morbid framing should have terrified me. Instead, I found it oddly comforting that he was finally taking interest in our shared financial responsibilities. Now I understood he'd been conducting reconnaissance for theft, not planning for our shared future. Every warning sign had been there. I'd simply been too trusting to recognize them as preparation for the ultimate betrayal. The morning Lawrence executed his plan, he performed his deception with the confidence of someone who believed he held all the power. I was in the kitchen making breakfast when he appeared. already dressed in his best suit, the charcoal gray one I'd bought him for our anniversary last year. His hair was perfectly styled, his cologne subtle but expensive, and his demeanor carried the focused energy of someone about to close an important deal. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, kissing my cheek with practiced affection. "I hate to bring up business so early, but we've got a situation at work that needs immediate attention." I continued scrambling eggs, keeping my voice neutral. "What kind of situation?" "The Henderson merger is moving faster than expected. Their board wants to see a comprehensive marketing strategy by Friday, and Edgar thinks this could be the deal that puts us on the map nationally." Lawrence poured himself coffee, his movements deliberate and calm. "The problem is we need to move quickly on a marketing blitz to show them we're serious players." I nodded encouragingly, though I knew the Henderson merger timeline intimately, since I'd been negotiating it directly with their CEO for months. There was no rushed marketing requirement, no Friday deadline, no emergency of any kind. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, playing my expected role. "Around $120,000 for the full campaign package. TV spots in 3 markets, digital advertising, print materials, the works." Lawrence leaned against the counter, his expression earnest and slightly stressed. "Edgar's already approved it, but the marketing firm needs payment up front before they'll start production." The lie was so smooth, so perfectly crafted with just enough detail to sound legitimate without being verifiable. If I'd been the naive housewife he believed me to be, I would have found his urgency compelling, his stress genuine. "That's a lot of money," I said carefully. "I know, and I hate asking you to access our savings, but this is the opportunity we've been working toward for years." Lawrence moved closer, taking my hands in his. "Once this merger goes through, my partnership stake becomes worth real money. We're talking about our future here, Sienna. Our future." The phrase that had once filled me with excitement now felt like mockery. "What does Edgar think about using our personal funds for company expenses?" I asked. Lawrence's expression flickered, just for a moment, before resuming its earnest concern. "He's uncomfortable asking employees to front company money, but I convinced him that as senior partner, I should take the initiative. It shows leadership, commitment to the firm's success." Another perfect lie. Edgar would never approve personal funding for company expenses, as Lawrence knew very well from 8 years of working there. "I'll need to transfer it this morning," Lawrence continued. "The marketing firm has other clients interested, and we can't risk losing our slot in their production schedule." The artificial urgency was textbook manipulation: create time pressure to prevent careful consideration, make the decision seem binary between opportunity and failure. "Which account should I send it to?" I asked, reaching for my phone as if convinced. Lawrence handed me a slip of paper with account information already written out. "This is their business account. Make sure to reference Henderson Marketing Initiative in the transfer notes." I looked at the paper, recognizing Camille's account number from my earlier research. The reference note was a nice touch. It would make the transfer appear legitimate in our banking records, at least superficially. $127,000 should cover everything with a small buffer, Lawrence said, his voice carrying just the right amount of financial caution. "Better to have slightly too much than risk the campaign falling short." I opened my banking app, Lawrence watching over my shoulder as I navigated to the transfer screen. His breathing was steady, his demeanor patient, but I could sense the anticipation beneath his calm exterior. This was the moment he'd been planning for months, the culmination of his carefully constructed deception. "There," I said, completing the transfer with a few taps. "It's done." Lawrence's relief was palpable, though he tried to hide it behind gratitude. "Thank you, sweetheart. I know this is a big ask, but I promise you won't regret it. When the Henderson deal closes, we'll be set for life." He kissed me again, lingering just long enough to seem genuine, then gathered his briefcase and headed for the door. "I'll probably be late tonight," he called back. "Big presentation prep with the team. Don't wait up." I watched through the kitchen window as he drove away, his posture confident and satisfied. In his mind, he'd just secured the funding for his new life with Camille, while positioning me as a willing accomplice to my own financial destruction. What Lawrence didn't know was that I'd been recording our entire conversation on my phone. What he also didn't know was that while the transfer had indeed gone through to Camille's account, it had triggered automated alerts to both Edgar and our attorney Melissa Parker, alerts I'd set up the previous day. By the time Lawrence reached his office, confident in his successful deception, the machinery of his destruction was already in motion. In 3 hours, Edgar would confront him with evidence of the theft. In 6 hours, Camille would discover that receiving stolen funds made her an accessory to felony embezzlement. In 24 hours, Lawrence Mills would no longer be employed at the company he thought he was destined to inherit. But first I had breakfast to finish and justice to orchestrate. To truly understand the magnitude of Lawrence's betrayal, I need to take you back to where our story really began. Not at that charity fundraiser where we met, but 3 months earlier in the sterile conference room of Hartford General Hospital, where my grandmother lay dying. Eleanor Rudd had been the strongest person I'd ever known. She'd built a successful catering business from nothing, raised 4 children as a single mother, and accumulated a modest fortune through decades of careful investment and frugal living. At 89, even weakened by illness, her mind remained sharp as steel. "Sienna," she whispered during one of our last conversations, her papery hand gripping mine with surprising strength. "I'm leaving you the bulk of my estate, but it comes with a responsibility." I tried to protest. My cousins needed the money more. I had a good job and no dependents, but she cut me off with a look that brooked no argument. "Money without purpose is just numbers in an account," she said. "I've watched too many inheritances turn into boats and vacations and nothing lasting. I want you to build something meaningful, something that helps people and grows beyond yourself." The inheritance was larger than I'd expected, $400,000 in carefully managed investments, plus her house in West Hartford. But it was her letter, delivered by her attorney after the funeral, that truly shaped my future. "Sienna," the letter began in her careful handwriting, "by the time you read this I'll be gone, and you'll be wondering what an old woman expects you to do with money you never asked for. The answer is simple: find something worth believing in, then make it better than it was before you found it." She went on to describe her own journey, how she'd started her catering business with $300 borrowed from a friend, how she'd grown it by treating every client like family, how she'd invested the profits in companies she believed were making the world better. "I never got rich quick," she wrote, "but I got rich helping other people succeed. That's the only kind of wealth that matters." 3 months later, when Lawrence introduced me to Edgar Mills and his struggling consulting firm, I heard my grandmother's voice in every word Edgar spoke about sustainable business practices and ethical consulting. This wasn't just a company, it was exactly the kind of meaningful enterprise she'd wanted me to support. But there was another layer to my decision that I'd never told Lawrence, something that made his betrayal cut even deeper. The day I decided to invest in Mills and Associates, I'd driven to my grandmother's house, now mine, and sat in her kitchen reading through her business journals. She'd kept meticulous records not just of her financial transactions, but of her reasoning behind every major decision. One entry, dated 20 years earlier, stopped me cold. "Met with young couple today about catering their wedding." The man kept interrupting his fiancée, dismissing her ideas, taking credit for suggestions she'd made. "I almost declined the job. I don't like to see women diminished, but the girl seemed sweet, and I decided to give them a chance." 3 years later, they divorced. He'd been cheating with his secretary the entire time. Some patterns never change. Note to self: trust your instincts about character. Business success without personal integrity is just elaborate theft. Reading that entry, I'd thought about Lawrence's genuine respect for my opinions, his collaborative approach to decision-making, his obvious admiration for strong women like my grandmother. He seemed like everything my grandmother would have approved of: ambitious, but ethical, successful but humble. How wrong I'd been. The investment process itself should have revealed Lawrence's true character, but I was too infatuated to see the signs. When Edgar and I were negotiating the ownership structure, Lawrence kept trying to insert himself into conversations that didn't involve him. "Maybe I should have a larger equity stake," he'd suggest during breaks in our legal meetings. "After all, I'm the one who brought you two together. Edgar would politely redirect these comments, but I noticed the pattern. Lawrence seemed to believe that introducing an investor entitled him to a broker's fee, that facilitating the connection gave him ownership over the outcome. During our due diligence period, I spent long afternoons at the Mills and Associates office, reviewing files and observing operations. Lawrence would hover nearby, explaining processes I was perfectly capable of understanding myself, occasionally correcting my questions, as if I were a confused child rather than an experienced financial analyst. What Sienna means, he'd say, when I'd ask Edgar about client retention strategies, is how do we know these accounts will stay loyal if we expand too quickly? Then he'd elaborate on my question as if he'd thought of it himself. Edgar noticed these interactions, but attributed them to normal protective instincts, a boyfriend looking out for his girlfriend's interests. Neither of us recognized them as early signs of someone who believed other people's contributions belonged to him by proximity. The most telling moment came during our final contract signing. My grandmother's attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Crawley, ironically sharing a surname with the woman who would later help destroy my marriage, pulled me aside with a concern. "Are you certain about keeping your ownership stake confidential?" she asked. In my experience, secrets in business partnerships often become weapons later. I dismissed her concern, explaining that Lawrence and I were building something together, that transparency would come naturally as our relationship deepened. Patricia had nodded politely, but I saw skepticism in her eyes. "Just remember," she said, "the agreements we're signing today protect you regardless of what happens to your personal relationships. Don't ever feel obligated to give up legal protections for the sake of keeping peace." Her words proved prophetic in ways I couldn't have imagined. The contracts she'd insisted on, with their termination clauses and breach of duty provisions, would become the foundation of Lawrence's downfall 8 years later. As I sat in my kitchen that morning, watching Lawrence drive away with stolen money and a clear conscience, I thought about my grandmother's journal entry and Patricia's warning. Both women had understood something I'd been too naive to see, that character reveals itself not in grand gestures, but in how someone treats the people who trust them most. Lawrence had just proven that my grandmother's instincts about charming men who diminish their partners were as accurate as ever. The protections that would ultimately destroy Lawrence had been carefully woven into our business agreements by two brilliant women who understood that trust in business requires verification through law. What appeared to be standard investment paperwork was actually an intricate web of safeguards designed to protect against exactly the kind of betrayal Lawrence was attempting. Patricia Crawley, my grandmother's attorney, had insisted on what she called nuclear options, clauses so severe that they would only be triggered by the most egregious breaches of trust. At the time, I'd thought her precautions excessive. Now I realized they were prophetic. The morning of Lawrence's theft, as I sat in my home office reviewing the original contracts, I marveled at Patricia's foresight. Every protection she'd insisted on was about to become devastatingly relevant. Article 15, Section 3 was particularly elegant in its precision. Any senior employee who engages in fraudulent transfer of company or personal funds shall immediately forfeit all equity stakes, employment benefits, and future claims against the company. The clause went further, establishing that fraudulent transfer included any deception used to gain access to funds belonging to shareholders or their spouses. By lying to me about the marketing campaign to steal our savings, Lawrence had triggered this clause automatically. His 5% equity stake, worth approximately $210,000 at current valuation, would revert to the company immediately upon discovery of the fraud. Article 18 was even more devastating. Any employee who shares confidential client information with unauthorized third parties, including romantic partners, shall be subject to immediate termination and civil liability for damages. Patricia had included specific language about proprietary methodologies and client intelligence, almost as if she'd anticipated someone like Camille gaining access to sensitive information through personal relationships. But the most sophisticated protection was Article 22, which Patricia had called her corporate death penalty clause. If any senior employee attempted to start a competing business using client relationships, proprietary methods, or confidential information gained through their position at Mills and Associates, the company could seek injunctive relief to shut down the competing venture, and claim all profits generated through stolen intellectual property. Lawrence's business plan for Crawley Consulting Solutions violated this clause in spectacular fashion. The document Edgar had found outlined systematic theft of client relationships, copying of proprietary assessment tools, and explicit plans to undercut Mills and Associates pricing using inside knowledge of our profit margins. What made these protections particularly powerful was how Patricia had structured the enforcement mechanisms. Rather than relying on expensive litigation that could drag on for years, she'd created automatic triggers that activated immediately upon evidence of violation. The burden of proof was reversed. Once a violation was documented, the accused party had to prove their innocence, rather than the company having to prove guilt. It's like a corporate immune system, Patricia had explained during our original contract negotiations. Most people never encounter these clauses, because they never engage in the behaviors that trigger them. But if someone does betray the company's trust, the response is swift and devastating. The financial protections were equally sophisticated. Patricia had required that any personal loans or investments from shareholders be secured by the company's assets, but with a twist: if the borrowed funds were misused or not returned, the interest rate automatically increased to 18% annually, compounded monthly, with personal liability extending to the borrower's spouse and immediate family. Lawrence's theft of my $127,000 had triggered this clause as well. The moment he transferred the money to Camille's account under false pretenses, he'd created a debt to the company of $127,000 plus punitive interest. If not repaid within 30 days, the company could place liens on any property he owned, including our house. But Patricia's masterpiece was the reputation protection clause buried in Article 25. If any former employee attempted to damage the company's reputation through false statements, industrial espionage, or client interference, Mills and Associates could seek damages equal to 3 times the company's annual revenue, currently about $12.6 million. This clause would prove critical in dealing with Camille, whose plan to poach clients using confidential information constituted textbook tortious interference with business relationships. The beauty of Patricia's legal architecture was how the clauses reinforced each other. Lawrence couldn't simply resign and walk away, because his fraud had created personal liability. He couldn't start a competing business because that would trigger additional penalty. He couldn't disparage the company because that would multiply his financial exposure exponentially. Melissa Parker, the attorney handling our current situation, had studied Patricia's original work with something approaching reverence. "I've never seen contract language this comprehensive," she'd told me during our emergency consultation. "It's like she anticipated every possible betrayal scenario and created specific deterrents for each one." The implementation process was equally elegant. Rather than requiring expensive court proceedings, Patricia had established an internal review mechanism where documented evidence of violations could be presented to a 3-person arbitration panel. Edgar and I would each choose one arbitrator, and those two would select a third neutral party. Decisions were final and immediately enforceable. "We can have Lawrence terminated and his equity forfeited within 48 hours of presenting evidence," Melissa explained. "The arbitration hearing is more of a formality. The contract language is so clear that there's really no room for dispute." The psychological impact of these protections was as important as their legal force. Once Lawrence understood the full scope of the consequences he faced, his bargaining position would collapse entirely. He couldn't threaten litigation because he'd already violated multiple clauses that made him liable for the company's legal fees. He couldn't refuse to cooperate because non-compliance would trigger additional penalties. Patricia had created a system where betrayal became self-defeating, where the very act of violating trust automatically generated the tools for its own punishment. As I prepared for the day that would destroy Lawrence's carefully constructed deceptions, I felt profound gratitude for my grandmother's wisdom in choosing Patricia Crawley as her attorney. The woman had protected me from threats I hadn't even known existed, using legal structures so sophisticated that Lawrence never realized he was walking into a trap of his own making. By noon, he would discover that his theft hadn't just cost him money, it had cost him everything. The transformation of my marriage didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual erosion so subtle that I convinced myself each change was temporary. each shift in Lawrence's behavior just a phase that would pass once work stress decreased or company goals were achieved. Looking back now, I can see the precise timeline of how love became manipulation, partnership became exploitation. The first year of our marriage had been everything I'd dreamed of. Lawrence would come home excited to share details about client meetings, genuinely interested in my perspectives on business strategy. We'd spend Sunday mornings in bed, laptops balanced between us, reviewing company reports and brainstorming solutions to operational challenges. He'd implement my suggestions at work and credit me during team meetings, introducing innovative approaches as ideas Sienna and I developed together. Hetsam Tarias, "You're my secret weapon," he'd tell me, wrapping his arms around me as we watched the company's quarterly revenues climb. "Edgar's brilliant with the technical stuff, but you understand the big picture in ways I never could alone." That version of Lawrence felt like my true partner. We were building something meaningful together, combining my analytical skills with his client relationships and Edgar's expertise. The future seemed limitless. The change began during our second year, so gradually that I attributed it to natural growing pains. Lawrence started bringing home less detailed information about work, explaining that client confidentiality had become more important as the company grew. Our Sunday morning strategy sessions became less frequent, replaced by his need to compartmentalize work and home life for better balance. "I don't want to burden you with business stress," he'd say when I'd ask about projects I knew he was struggling with. "You're too important to me to become another source of work pressure." It sounded thoughtful, even protective. I didn't recognize it as the beginning of my systematic exclusion from decisions that affected my own investment. By year 3, the dynamic had shifted noticeably. Lawrence stopped asking my opinion on business matters entirely, though he'd still listen politely when I'd offer insights. More telling, he'd begun interrupting my contributions during the few company social events I still attended. "Sienna has some interesting theories about market positioning," he'd say with an indulgent smile, though of course the actual implementation is more complex than it looks from the outside. The phrase "from the outside" stung every time. I wasn't outside the business, I was the primary investor, the majority owner, the person whose capital had built everything he was taking credit for. But Lawrence had begun constructing a narrative where my involvement was peripheral, supportive rather than foundational. Year 4 brought the first real fights. Lawrence had started making unilateral decisions about company direction, investments I disagreed with based on the detailed financial reports Edgar shared with me. When I'd express concerns, Lawrence would become defensive, then dismissive. "You're second-guessing every decision I make," he'd say during one particularly heated argument about a risky expansion plan. "I can't run a business if my own wife doesn't trust my judgment." The manipulation was sophisticated. He'd turned my legitimate business concerns into personal attacks on his competence, making me the problem for questioning decisions that could affect our shared future. By year 5, Lawrence had perfected the art of using my insights without acknowledging their source. I'd mention market trends I'd researched, and 2 weeks later he'd present identical analysis at board meetings as his own work. I'd suggest client retention strategies during dinner conversations, then watch him implement them at the office while taking full credit. When I'd point out these patterns, he'd act genuinely confused. "Great minds think alike," he'd say with a laugh. "Just because you mention something doesn't mean I can't independently reach the same conclusion." The gaslighting was so subtle, so consistent, that I began doubting my own perceptions. Maybe I wasn't as insightful as I thought. Maybe Lawrence's success really was independent of my contributions. The 6th and 7th years brought active hostility whenever I tried to engage with business matters. Lawrence would sigh heavily when I'd ask about company performance, roll his eyes when I'd offer suggestions, and actively change subjects when I'd try to discuss strategic concerns. "Can we have one dinner without you trying to be a consultant?" became his standard complaint. "I get enough business analysis at work. At home I just want to relax with my wife." But the cruelest evolution was how he'd begun describing me to others. I'd overhear him on phone calls, explaining to friends that I was really into the business stuff with the tone one might use to describe a harmless but tedious hobby. At company parties, he'd introduce me as someone who likes to think she understands consulting rather than acknowledging my actual role in the company's success. The 8th year, our final year, was characterized by complete dismissal. Lawrence would shut down any attempt I made to discuss business, treating my questions as intrusions rather than legitimate concerns from a major stakeholder. "Sienna, you're a wonderful wife, but business operations are beyond your expertise," he'd say with patronizing patience. "Trust me to handle what I do best, and I'll trust you to handle the home front." The home front, as if managing our household was equivalent to managing a multi-million-dollar company I'd helped build from nothing. The most devastating realization wasn't that Lawrence had stopped valuing my contributions, it was that he'd never truly valued them at all. He'd used my insights, my capital, and my support to build his career, then convinced himself that his success was entirely self-generated. When I'd try to remind him of my role in the company's growth, he'd look at me with genuine confusion, as if I were claiming credit for accomplishments that had nothing to do with me. "You've been supportive, absolutely," he'd concede. "But let's not overstate your involvement. I'm the one with the business relationships, the strategic vision, the day-to-day operational knowledge." By the time Lawrence stole our savings to fund his affair with Camille, he'd spent years convincing himself that I was nothing more than an accessory to his success story, someone whose presence was pleasant but whose absence wouldn't materially affect anything important. He was about to learn how catastrophically wrong he'd been. Once I had full access to Mills and Associates' internal systems as the revealed majority owner, the scope of Lawrence's corruption became breathtakingly clear. What I'd initially assumed was a personal betrayal, stealing our savings for his affair, was actually just the tip of an iceberg that threatened to sink the entire company Edgar and I had spent 8 years building. The forensic audit I'd commissioned revealed systematic financial manipulation dating back 18 months. Lawrence hadn't just been stealing money, he'd been restructuring the entire operation to benefit himself and his mistress while disguising the theft as legitimate business expenses. The client billing irregularities were the most sophisticated part of his scheme. Lawrence had created a web of fictional consulting categories: advanced strategic assessment, proprietary market analysis, executive coordination services, that allowed him to inflate project costs without triggering client complaints. The additional charges were small enough to seem reasonable, but they added up to nearly $200,000 in fraudulent billing over the past year. "Look at the Henderson Industries account," Edgar said, spreading printouts across my dining room table during one of our evening strategy sessions. "Lawrence billed them $47,000 for executive coordination services last quarter, but when I checked with Henderson's project manager, they have no record of receiving any coordination services beyond our standard deliverables." The money from these phantom services had been funneled into a discretionary account Lawrence controlled ostensibly for business development activities. In reality, he'd been using the funds to finance an increasingly lavish lifestyle with Camille, expensive dinners at restaurants our legitimate clients never saw, weekend getaways to luxury hotels, shopping sprees for jewelry and clothing that somehow qualified as professional wardrobe expenses. But the client billing fraud was minor compared to what Lawrence had done to our employee compensation structure. Over the past year, he'd systematically suppressed salary increases for long-term employees while creating generous bonuses for a small group of recent hires, all of whom had personal connections to either Lawrence or Camille. "Robert from engineering hasn't received a merit increase in 2 years," I noted, reviewing the human resources files. Meanwhile, Camille's college roommate Ashley was hired as a communications specialist at a salary 40% higher than our senior project managers, despite having no relevant experience. Edgar shook his head in disgust. "Lawrence told me Ashley was a bargain because she'd work for below-market rates. I never saw the actual employment contract." The employment contracts revealed the true scope of Lawrence's deception. He'd been signing agreements without board approval, creating positions that duplicated existing functions, and establishing compensation packages that violated our carefully maintained salary equity principles. Worse, many of these new employees had been given access to confidential client information despite having no legitimate need for such access. "This is corporate espionage," I told Melissa Parker during one of our legal strategy sessions. Lawrence has essentially created a shadow organization within our company, staffed with people loyal to him rather than to Mills and Associates. The evidence suggested this shadow organization was preparing to become Crawley Consulting Solutions, the competing firm Lawrence and Camille planned to launch. The business plan Edgar had discovered wasn't just stealing our clients, it was stealing our employees, our methodologies, and our competitive advantages. Most damaging was Lawrence's systematic violation of client confidentiality agreements. The forensic audit revealed that he'd been copying sensitive client files to personal storage devices, sharing proprietary market research with unauthorized personnel, and discussing confidential strategic plans with Camille, despite her having no clearance for such information. The liability exposure is enormous, Melissa warned. If even one client discovers their confidential information was compromised, we could face lawsuits that would bankrupt the company. And there's evidence that information has already been shared with potential competitors. The trail led to Ashley Bosch, Camille's roommate, who had been working as a freelance consultant for companies that directly competed with Mills and Associates clients. The methodologies she was selling to these competitors were identical to proprietary systems we'd developed over years of client work, systems Lawrence had provided through Camille. They've been beta testing their theft operation, Edgar realized as we reviewed the evidence, using our current client base to fund the development of competing services they plan to offer independently. But the most personally devastating discovery was how Lawrence had been manipulating our joint finances long before the obvious theft of our savings. The forensic accountant I'd hired found evidence of systematic financial abuse dating back 2 years, credit cards opened in my name without my knowledge, investment accounts accessed using forged authorization documents, even applications for business loans using our house as collateral. Your husband has been treating your shared assets as his personal slush fund, the accountant explained. The $127,000 transfer to Camille's account wasn't his first theft, it was just the largest single transaction. The total amount of misappropriated funds exceeded $300,000 when personal and business theft were combined. Lawrence had been financing his double life by systematically stealing from every revenue stream he could access: company accounts, client billing, our personal savings, even my individual investment portfolio that he'd gained access to through our joint tax filings. The psychological impact was as devastating as the financial damage. Every vacation we'd taken, every dinner we'd shared, every moment of apparent intimacy over the past 2 years had been funded, at least partially, by money he'd stolen from me and the company I'd helped build. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a temporary lapse in judgment, I told Edgar as we prepared for the confrontation that would end Lawrence's career. This was a systematic, premeditated campaign to destroy everything we've built while enriching himself and his girlfriend. The evidence filled 3 bankers' boxes: printed emails, forged documents, financial records, witness statements from employees who'd noticed irregularities but hadn't known who to report them to. Every piece of paper represented another betrayal, another violation of the trust that had made Lawrence's position possible. As I organized the final presentation that would destroy his career, I felt no satisfaction, only grim determination. Lawrence hadn't just stolen money, he'd stolen the futures of every employee who depended on Mills and Associates for their livelihood, every client who trusted us with their confidential information, every relationship Edgar and I had spent years building. Tomorrow he would face the consequences of believing that trust was just another resource to be exploited. The moment Lawrence left our house that morning, confident he'd successfully stolen our savings, I activated a plan that had been months in preparation. Every phone call I made, every email I sent, every meeting I scheduled, was designed to systematically dismantle the web of deception he'd spent 2 years constructing. My first call was to Edgar, using the encrypted communication system we'd established for sensitive business matters. Phase 1 is complete, I said simply. Lawrence took the bait exactly as predicted. Edgar's voice was grim but determined. The automated alerts have been triggered. Our forensic accountant received notification of the transfer at 8:17 a.m. Melissa got the same alert 3 minutes later. Perfect. How long until the emergency board meeting? 90 minutes. I've already contacted all 5 board members. They've been briefed on the general situation and understand the urgency. While Edgar handled the board logistics, I initiated the second phase of our response. A call to Detective Cameron Rudd of the Hartford Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, a connection I'd cultivated months ago, when I first suspected Lawrence might be engaging in criminal activity. Detective Rudd, this is Sienna Mills. We discussed the possibility of corporate embezzlement at Mills & Associates. I'm ready to file a formal complaint with documented evidence. How much are we talking about? Detective Rudd asked, her voice professional, but interested. Over $300,000 in combined personal and corporate theft, plus systematic client fraud and industrial espionage. I have comprehensive documentation ready for review. I'll be at your office in 2 hours with a full investigative team. The third phase involved activating our client protection protocols. Edgar and I had secretly developed these procedures months ago, when we first discovered Lawrence's inappropriate access to confidential files. Now it was time to implement them. I spent the next hour personally calling the CEOs of our 5 largest clients: Henderson Industries, Morrison Technologies, Westfield Manufacturing, Bosch Engineering, and Crawley Dynamics. Each conversation followed the same careful script. This is Sienna Mills from Mills & Associates. I need to inform you that we've discovered a serious breach of your account confidentiality. One of our employees has been accessing your files without authorization and sharing sensitive information with outside parties. The reactions were immediate and predictable: shock, anger, demands for detailed explanations. But I was prepared with solutions, not just problems. We're implementing immediate containment measures, I explained to each client. The employee in question is being terminated today, all compromised files are being secured, and we're providing you with comprehensive forensic analysis of exactly what information was accessed and when. Most importantly, I offered each client something Lawrence never could have provided: complete transparency about the ownership structure that gave me authority to make these guarantees. I want you to understand that as the majority owner of Mills & Associates, I take personal responsibility for this breach. Edgar Mills and I are prepared to offer compensation for any damages, additional security measures at no charge, and my personal guarantee that nothing like this will ever happen again. The revelation of my ownership stake transformed every conversation. Instead of angry clients threatening to terminate contracts, I found myself talking to business partners who appreciated both the transparency and the decisive response to the crisis. We've worked with Mills & Associates for 6 years, said Marcus Henderson from Henderson Industries. If you and Edgar are personally committed to resolving this situation, we're willing to work with you through it. By 10:30 a.m., I had secured written commitments from all 5 major clients to maintain their contracts pending resolution of the security breach. What could have been a company-ending crisis had become an opportunity to strengthen client relationships through radical transparency. The fourth phase was the most personally satisfying, neutralizing Camille's role in Lawrence's scheme. I placed a call to her direct line at Mills & Associates, knowing Lawrence would be in the emergency board meeting Edgar had called. Camille, this is Sienna Mills. I need you to come to conference room B immediately for a personnel matter. I'm sorry, Mrs. Mills, but I don't report to you. I'll need authorization from Lawrence before. Actually, you do report to me. As the majority owner of Mills & Associates, I have authority over all personnel decisions. You have 5 minutes to reach conference room B, or security will escort you there. The silence on the other end was profound. Camille had spent months positioning herself as Lawrence's partner in rebuilding the company hierarchy. The discovery that his wife, the woman she'd dismissed as an irrelevant housewife, actually controlled the entire organization must have been devastating. When Camille arrived in the conference room, she found me waiting with Melissa Parker, Detective Rudd, and a complete file documenting her role in Lawrence's criminal enterprise. Miss Crawley, I began formally, you're being terminated immediately for violation of client confidentiality agreements, unauthorized access to proprietary information, and conspiracy to commit corporate theft. These termination proceedings are being recorded for legal purposes. Camille's confident demeanor crumbled as Melissa read the specific charges against her. Receipt of stolen funds, industrial espionage, tortious interference with business relationships, each violation carrying both criminal penalties and civil liability. You can't do this, Camille stammered. Lawrence said you had no authority here, that you were just what? I interrupted, just the person who owns 75% of this company. Just the investor whose money built everything Lawrence has been taking credit for. Just the business partner who's been watching you help him steal from clients and employees for the past 18 months. The psychological impact was immediate and complete. Camille had built her entire relationship with Lawrence on the foundation of his perceived power and my supposed irrelevance. Discovering that the power dynamic was exactly reversed, destroyed not just her career prospects, but her understanding of the situation she'd invested herself in. Lawrence will fight this, she said weakly. Lawrence is currently discovering that his employment contract contains automatic termination clauses for exactly the behaviors he's been engaging in. By the time you see him again, he'll be facing criminal charges and civil liability that will take years to resolve. As security escorted Camille from the building, I felt the satisfaction of watching months of careful preparation come to fruition. Lawrence had spent 2 years systematically undermining my position, convinced that I was powerless to stop him. He was about to learn that power hidden is often more devastating than power displayed. The hours following Lawrence's termination were a masterclass in forensic corporate investigation. What had started as my personal quest for justice had evolved into a comprehensive examination of every aspect of Mills & Associates' operations, revealing layers of corruption that shocked even the seasoned investigators I'd brought in to document the evidence. Detective Rudd arrived with a team of 3 specialists, a forensic accountant, a digital crimes expert, and a corporate fraud investigator. They transformed our main conference room into a command center, with whiteboards mapping financial flows, computers analyzing digital evidence, and boxes of documents organized by category and severity of violation. In 20 years of investigating corporate crime, Detective Rudd told me as her team worked, I've rarely seen such systematic documentation of criminal activity. Your husband either thought he was untouchable, or he genuinely believed he wouldn't get caught. The digital forensics revealed the most damaging evidence. Lawrence's computer contained thousands of files that should have been confidential, client financial records, strategic plans, competitive intelligence, and proprietary methodologies that represented years of development work. More troubling, the metadata showed these files had been regularly copied to external drives and cloud storage accounts registered under Camille's name. He's been conducting industrial espionage on a massive scale, the digital crimes expert explained, showing me the file access logs. Every major client contract, every proprietary assessment tool, every competitive advantage your company has developed, he's been systematically copying everything to external systems. The timing was particularly telling. The bulk of the digital theft had occurred during evening hours and weekends, often coinciding with the security footage showing Lawrence and Camille in his office after business hours. Their romantic encounters had provided cover for the largest corporate data theft in Mills & Associates history, but Lawrence's overconfidence had created an evidentiary goldmine. Instead of covering his tracks, he'd kept detailed records of his criminal activities, apparently believing that documentation would help him manage his expanding schemes. His personal laptop contained spreadsheets tracking the money he'd stolen from various sources: client overbilling, company expense fraud, unauthorized access to our personal accounts, even small thefts from petty cash that dated back 3 years. Each entry was meticulously categorized, as if he'd been preparing tax documents for his criminal enterprise. Look at this, the forensic accountant said, pointing to a particularly damaging spreadsheet titled Revenue Enhancement Initiatives. He's been treating theft as a business strategy, tracking return on investment for different types of fraud. The psychological profile that emerged was of someone who'd convinced himself that stealing was actually a form of business innovation. Lawrence had created elaborate justifications for each category of theft. Client overbilling was value-added services, expense fraud was executive compensation adjustments, and stealing our savings was capital reallocation for strategic purposes. More damaging were the email communications between Lawrence and Camille, which the digital forensics team recovered from supposedly deleted files. These messages revealed not just the affair, but detailed planning for systematic corporate sabotage. We need to accelerate the client transition timeline, Camille had written in a message dated 3 months ago. Once we launch Crawley Consulting, we'll need to move fast to prevent Mills and Associates from recovering. Can you create disruption in their key accounts to make the transition smoother? Lawrence's response was chilling in its calculated cruelty. Already working on that. I'm going to start missing critical deadlines on the Henderson project, create quality control problems that make Edgar look incompetent. By the time we're ready to launch, their reputation will be damaged enough that clients will welcome alternatives. The evidence showed Lawrence had indeed been sabotaging projects he was responsible for, deliberately creating problems that made the entire company look unreliable. Client complaints that Edgar and I had attributed to normal business challenges were actually the result of intentional sabotage designed to weaken Mills and Associates' market position. This goes beyond theft, Detective Rudd observed. Your husband was actively trying to destroy the company to benefit his planned competing venture. That's criminal conspiracy on multiple levels. The investigation also revealed the full scope of employee manipulation Lawrence had been conducting. Several long-term employees came forward once they understood the investigation was legitimate, sharing instances where Lawrence had pressured them to cut corners, falsify timesheets, or provide him with confidential information about colleagues. He told me that Edgar was considering layoffs, and that cooperation with his efficiency initiatives would protect my job, explained Robert from engineering. I gave him access to proprietary design files because I thought I was helping save the company. Sarah from accounting had a similar story. Lawrence said, Mrs. Mills, you were pushing for cost cuts that might eliminate my position. He offered to protect me if I helped him identify redundancies in other departments. The pattern was consistent and sophisticated. Lawrence had been using fear and misinformation to turn loyal employees into unwilling accomplices in his schemes, creating networks of people who thought they were protecting their jobs while actually enabling his criminal activities. Most disturbing was the evidence of how he'd been manipulating client relationships. The investigation revealed that Lawrence had been secretly negotiating with competitors, offering to provide them with Mills and Associates client lists and proprietary methodologies in exchange for positions at their firms or consulting contracts for his planned venture. He had backup plans for his backup plans. I told Edgar as we reviewed the final evidence compilation. If Crawley Consulting didn't work out, he had offers from 3 competing firms, all based on information he'd stolen from us. The investigation consumed 48 hours and generated over 500 pages of documented evidence. By the time Detective Rudd's team finished their work, we had proof of criminal activity spanning nearly 3 years, involving theft of over $300,000, systematic client fraud, industrial espionage, and conspiracy to destroy the company that had made Lawrence's career possible. This is one of the most comprehensive corporate crime cases I've ever seen, Detective Rudd told me as her team prepared to leave. Your husband is going to face serious criminal charges, and the civil liability could take decades to resolve. As I reviewed the final evidence packages, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that justice would be served, sadness that it had taken such devastating betrayal to reveal Lawrence's true character. But mostly I felt relief. After months of suspicion and weeks of investigation, I finally had irrefutable proof of what Lawrence had become, and the legal foundation to ensure he would never harm another business or another partner again. The evidence was overwhelming, the case was airtight, and Lawrence Mills was about to discover that his crime spree had created the instruments of his own destruction. The confrontation I'd been planning for months finally came at 2:30 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, in the same conference room where Lawrence had fired countless loyal employees to make room for Camille's incompetent friends. The irony wasn't lost on me as I arranged the evidence files across the polished mahogany table where he'd once held court as the self-proclaimed future of Mills and Associates. Lawrence arrived expecting a routine board meeting, summoned by Edgar with vague references to operational concerns that require senior management input. He walked into the conference room with his usual confident stride, expensive suit perfectly pressed, carrying the leather portfolio I'd bought him for our 5th anniversary. His confidence evaporated the moment he saw the assembled group. Edgar sat at the head of the table, his expression grim but resolute. Detective Rudd occupied the chair to Edgar's right, her badge clearly visible, a digital recorder placed prominently in front of her. Melissa Parker sat across from the detective, legal documents organized in neat stacks before her, and I sat at the far end of the table, in the chair typically reserved for outside consultants, except today, I was clearly running the meeting. Sienna, Lawrence's voice carried genuine confusion. What's going on here? Edgar said this was a board meeting about operational issues. It is, I replied calmly. Please, sit down. We have quite a lot to discuss. Lawrence remained standing, his eyes darting between the detective and the lawyer, clearly calculating whether he should leave immediately. I don't understand why police are present for a business meeting. Sit down, Lawrence, Edgar said quietly. You're going to want to hear this. The moment Lawrence took his seat, I opened the first evidence folder and slid a bank statement across the table. Let's start with this morning. You told me you needed $127,000 for an emergency marketing campaign for the Henderson merger. The money was transferred to an account registered to Camille Crawley. Can you explain the business justification for that transaction? Lawrence's face went pale, but he recovered quickly. That was a temporary holding account. The marketing firm required the funds to be held in an escrow arrangement. Camille was handling the coordination as my executive assistant. Interesting, I said, sliding a second document across the table. Because Henderson Industries has no record of authorizing any marketing campaign. In fact, their CEO confirms they made no such request and have no knowledge of any emergency timeline. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Lawrence stared at the Henderson Industries letterhead, his carefully constructed lie crumbling in real time. There must be some confusion, he said finally. Perhaps a miscommunication between departments at Henderson. Perhaps, I agreed, opening a second folder. Let's move on to these expense reports. $43,000 in client entertainment charges over the past 6 months. Fascinating restaurants, all romantic, all expensive, all attended by you and Camille. Can you explain how intimate dinners for two qualify as client entertainment? Lawrence's jaw tightened. Those were business development meetings. Camille has strong relationships with potential clients in the sustainability sector. Really? I pulled out a third set of documents. Because our investigation couldn't find a single new client generated through these expensive dinners. What we did find were credit card receipts for jewelry, flowers, and hotel rooms that suggest these weren't business meetings at all. Detective Rudd leaned forward. Mr. Mills, you understand that using company funds for personal expenses constitutes embezzlement under Connecticut state law. I don't have to answer questions without an attorney present, Lawrence replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Actually you do, Melissa Parker interjected smoothly. Your employment contract includes specific language requiring cooperation with internal investigations. Refusal to answer questions constitutes grounds for immediate termination and forfeiture of all benefits. I watched Lawrence process this information, saw the moment he realized the legal trap he'd walked into. What exactly are you accusing me of? We're not accusing you of anything, I said quietly. We're presenting evidence of what you've already done. Systematic theft from company accounts, fraudulent client billing, unauthorized access to confidential information, industrial espionage, conspiracy to start a competing business using stolen client relationships and proprietary methodologies. With each accusation, I slid supporting evidence across the table. Bank statements showing diverted funds, client files copied to external drives, email communications with competitors, offering to sell Mills and Associates secrets. The business plan for Crawley Consulting Solutions that outlined systematic theft of our client base. Most importantly, I continued, opening the final folder, we have comprehensive evidence of your systematic manipulation of company operations to benefit yourself and Miss Crawley at the expense of longtime employees and loyal clients. Lawrence stared at the mountain of evidence, his confident demeanor completely shattered. You've been spying on me, he said weakly. I've been protecting the company I own, I corrected. The company you've been systematically stealing from and sabotaging for your own benefit. Own? Lawrence looked genuinely confused. Sienna, you're not an owner, you're married to a senior partner, but that doesn't give you. Actually, Edgar interrupted. She owns 75% of Mills and Associates. She has since the beginning. She provided the initial capital that saved this company, and she's been the majority shareholder for 8 years. The color drained completely from Lawrence's face. That's impossible. I would have known. I would have seen the paperwork. You saw what we chose to show you, I replied. We kept my ownership confidential to allow you to build your career without nepotism concerns. Unfortunately, you interpreted our discretion as weakness. Lawrence sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the true power dynamics he'd been operating within. Every decision he'd made, every employee he'd fired, every strategy he'd implemented, had been subject to my approval. He hadn't been running the company. He'd been an employee whose job security depended entirely on someone he'd been systematically betraying. This is your final opportunity, I said, pushing a settlement agreement across the table. Sign this document acknowledging your violations, agreeing to make full restitution, and accepting immediate termination with forfeiture of all equity stakes. In return, we'll pursue civil remedies only, not criminal charges. Lawrence picked up the settlement agreement with trembling hands, scanning the terms that would strip him of everything he'd built over 8 years. And if I don't sign, Detective Rudd answered, then I arrest you for embezzlement, fraud and conspiracy. You'll face criminal trial, potential prison time, and civil liability that could follow you for the rest of your life. Lawrence looked around the table, seeking any sign of sympathy or negotiating room. He found none. How long do I have to decide? I glanced at my watch. You have until I finish this sentence. Sign the agreement now, or Detective Rudd will read you your rights. With no options remaining, Lawrence signed the document that ended his career, his marriage, and his future at the company he'd thought he was destined to inherit. The confrontation was over, justice had been served, and Lawrence Mills finally understood the cost of betraying someone who'd trusted him with everything. The immediate aftermath of Lawrence's termination created a seismic shift throughout Mills and Associates that I could feel the moment I walked through the front doors as the officially recognized owner. The whispered conversations stopped when I passed, replaced by respectful nods and genuine smiles from employees who finally understood why their workplace was about to dramatically improve. My first act as the public face of ownership was calling an all-hands meeting in the main conference room. For 8 years I'd sat quietly in the back during company gatherings, dismissed as Lawrence's supportive wife by employees who had no idea I'd funded their paychecks from the beginning. Now I stood at the head of the table where Lawrence had once presided, addressing a room full of people whose professional lives I'd been secretly protecting all along. I know today's events have been shocking, I began, looking out at faces that ranged from curious to concerned, to quietly triumphant. Some of you are probably wondering what Lawrence's departure means for your job security. Let me be very clear, if you've been doing honest work and treating colleagues with respect, your position is more secure now than it's been in 2 years. The visible relief was immediate. Sarah from accounting actually teared up when I mentioned implementing immediate salary corrections for employees whose raises had been blocked by Lawrence's manipulations. Robert from engineering broke into a genuine smile when I announced that his promotion to senior engineer, delayed for months by Lawrence's interference, would be effective immediately. We're also implementing an open-door policy, I continued. If you have concerns about workplace issues, project management problems, or suspicious activities, you can bring them directly to Edgar or myself without fear of retaliation. The culture of intimidation ends today. The transformation over the following weeks was remarkable. Projects that had been stalled by Lawrence's deliberate sabotage suddenly moved forward smoothly. Client relationships improved dramatically once we addressed the service quality issues he'd been creating. Employee morale soared as people realized they could focus on doing good work instead of navigating office politics and artificial hierarchies. Most satisfying was restoring proper credit where it belonged. The sustainability initiatives that Lawrence had claimed as his innovations were publicly acknowledged as collaborative efforts between Edgar and myself. The client retention strategies he'd taken credit for were properly attributed to the team members who'd actually developed them. Edgar flourished in his restored role as CEO, no longer constrained by Lawrence's constant second-guessing and budget manipulations. It's like watching the company remember how to be itself again, he told me during one of our weekly strategy sessions. We're finally operating according to our actual values instead of Lawrence's version of them. The financial recovery exceeded all projections. Without Lawrence's systematic theft and waste, our profit margins improved by 23% within the first quarter. The client relationships I'd personally salvaged through transparent communication about the security breach led to contract extensions and expanded project scopes. 3 clients specifically requested to work directly with the owner who took responsibility and fixed the problems. Most importantly, we were able to implement the employee development programs I'd been advocating for years. Training opportunities that Lawrence had dismissed as unnecessary expenses were funded immediately. The profit-sharing plan Edgar and I had designed but never implemented due to Lawrence's objections was established with retroactive bonuses for employees whose contributions had been systematically undervalued. The Mills and Associates that emerged from Lawrence's betrayal was stronger, more ethical, and more successful than it had ever been during his tenure. We hadn't just survived his attempts at sabotage, we'd transformed his destruction into an opportunity to build something better. 6 months after Lawrence's termination, I stood in the renovated offices of Mills and Associates, watching our team celebrate the successful completion of the Henderson merger, the very project Lawrence had tried to sabotage to benefit his planned competing venture. The irony wasn't lost on me that his attempts at destruction had actually positioned us for our greatest success. The Henderson deal, finalized under Edgar's leadership with my strategic oversight, had tripled our company's valuation to $12.6 million. More importantly, it had established Mills and Associates as the premier sustainability consulting firm in New England, with a reputation for ethical practices and transparent leadership that attracted clients who valued integrity over flashy promises. Lawrence's criminal trial had concluded the previous month with a plea agreement that required full restitution of the stolen funds plus punitive damages. He'd been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation during which he was prohibited from working in consulting or financial services. His dreams of corporate leadership had been permanently destroyed by his own choices. Camille had faced her own consequences, pleading guilty to conspiracy charges and receiving a suspended sentence contingent on repaying the funds she'd received and completing 500 hours of community service. Her planned career in high-end consulting had evaporated the moment her involvement in corporate espionage became public record. But the most profound changes weren't in the courthouse or the corporate offices. They were in my own understanding of power, trust, and the responsibility that comes with both. I'd learned that true strength often comes from being underestimated, that patience can be more devastating than immediate retaliation, and that the best revenge is building something so successful that your betrayers become irrelevant. The personal transformation had been as significant as the professional one. I'd sold the house Lawrence and I had shared, using the proceeds to establish the Eleanor Rudd Foundation for Women Entrepreneurs, named after my grandmother, who'd understood that meaningful wealth comes from helping others succeed. The foundation provided low-interest loans and mentorship to women starting sustainable businesses, ensuring that my grandmother's values lived on through practical action. My new home was smaller but filled with light, decorated with art from local artists the foundation had supported. The walls displayed photos from company celebrations, successful project completions, and foundation grant ceremonies, images of collaborative success, rather than the posed perfection that had characterized my life with Lawrence. Edgar and I had become true business partners in every sense, sharing strategic decision-making while respecting each other's expertise. Our weekly planning sessions had evolved into collaborative strategizing that pushed the company toward innovations neither of us could have achieved alone. At 68, Edgar had found renewed energy in working with someone who valued his experience while contributing fresh perspectives. The employees who'd thrived under our new leadership structure had become evangelists for Mills and Associates culture, attracting talented candidates who wanted to work for a company where merit was rewarded and integrity wasn't negotiable. Our turnover rate had dropped to virtually zero, while our productivity and client satisfaction scores reached record highs. On quiet evenings in my home office, I sometimes reflected on the journey from betrayal to triumph. Lawrence had intended to leave me financially ruined and professionally irrelevant. Instead, his betrayal had forced me to claim the power I'd always possessed but never fully exercised. The greatest lesson wasn't about revenge or justice. It was about the importance of building systems and relationships strong enough to survive betrayal. My grandmother's inheritance had provided the initial capital, but Edgar's integrity, Melissa's legal expertise, and the loyalty of honest employees had created the foundation that made recovery possible. Mills and Associates continued to grow, guided by principles of transparency, collaboration, and sustainable success. We'd proven that ethical business practices weren't just morally superior, they were more profitable than the corner-cutting and manipulation Lawrence had favored. Lawrence had believed that trust was weakness to be exploited. He'd learned too late that trust, properly structured and carefully protected, was actually the strongest foundation for lasting success. The company he'd tried to destroy had become everything he'd never understood it could be.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.